have 3 living fossils to show you guys. Actually, the first one is right over there, and I brought you over here to look at it because it's best viewed from right here. That is a ginkgo, folks. Ginkgos were growing when dinosaurs walked the earth, and they actually used to be pretty much ubiquitous. At one point, ginkgo, which is ginkgo biloba, also called maidenhair tree. Has anybody else never heard it called maidenhair tree? I only ever hear it called ginkgo. That might be a Europe thing. They might call it maidenhair tree in Europe. Anyway, they were on every continent pretty much, although I think technically there was only one continent when they were around first. But anyhow, they exist as fossils all over the planet, and they were sort of dying off, and they were just left in parts of Asia when the modern era started, and people started moving plants literally up around the world. And so now ginkgos are everywhere. They're growing on every continent as far as I know. Probably not Antarctica. I don't think anything grows there, but the other 6 continents, you got ginkgos. The second one is this here. Does anybody know what this is?
China fir?
Not China fir. This is called Japanese umbrella pine. Sciadopitys verticillata is the fancy schmancy Latin name. Very fun to say at parties. Sciadopitys verticillata. It almost sounds like a poem. I'm sorry?
What parties do you go to?
None. I imagine that's what a party is like. Nobody invites me to party. Anyway, so you can see it's a conifer. This is a fresh cone. This is a not so fresh cone. They just sort of fall apart. But it's not actually a pine. If it was a pine, the name would be Pinus verticillata. This is actually much older than the pines. This is a species that doesn't have any relatives in the same genus, so it's called a monotypic genus. By the way, ginkgo is too. So there's no Sciadopitys alba, there's no Sciadopitys whatever apica, it's just Sciadopitys verticillata. And you add to that, it's lonely, right? It doesn't have any congeners. Well, it's also all alone in its family. The Sciadopitys genus is the only one in its family. There's no other genera in that family. It is taxonomically isolated, and that's because it almost went extinct as well. It is endemic to Japan, meaning that it only grows in Japan. Well, obviously now we're not in Japan. Originally, it was endemic to Japan. But it's kind of a cool tree. The way you really know it's not a pine is because the needles are held singly on the twig, and pines have what are called fascicles or bundles of needles. They either have 2 needles, 3 needles, or 5 needles, but sometimes those also can have 4 needles. And the reason for that is because it's nature. We have these grand ideas about organizing everything and categorizing and making it all logical. Nature doesn't care for that. Sciadopitys verticillata is a nice, regular, very predictable tree, and when you see it on the landscape, it usually is quite astounding, especially if you grow it out in the open and you let it get real big. It's just a beautiful shape, and I'm not sure deer like it, but you know, honestly, if it's a cold enough, harsh enough winter, deer will eat everything. They'll eat astroturf if they're hungry enough. So it's not deer proof, but it's a cool plant. I don't think it has invasive potential. Ginkgo does, but it really doesn't have any pests because I don't think anybody brought any of the pests from Japan with them when they started cultivating this. So you'll very rarely find any insects or diseases plaguing Japanese umbrella pine. And then finally, we've got a trio over here of dawn redwood. Does anybody know the story of dawn redwood?
Yeah, they were discovered in China. They thought they were extinct, right? And they were brought over here.
The story goes like this. This was considered a fossil, not a living fossil, because this species was not discovered as a living thing. The first time it was found by science, it was in fossils, and the paleobotanists that were examining it in the late 1930s recognized from the fine structures preserved in these fossils that it looked like a relative of the big trees, and those are Sequoiadendron giganteum, which is our giant sequoia, which lives in the high Sierra, and that's like the largest tree by mass and volume. Although you could argue there's recent discoveries in the last few years that might contest that. And the other one is the coast redwood, which is Sequoia sempervirens. And so we have sequoia, we have Sequoiadendron, and they named this third genus Metasequoia, which means kind of sort of like sequoia. And so Metasequoia glyptostroboides was what they named the fossil, and they presented it to the scientific community. And then a few years later, a Chinese national who was in China as part of Mao's military in the mountains stepped out of his tent one morning and looked up and found the fossil just living in the mountains. And so he wrote to people he knew in the West and said, hey, guess what? It's not actually extinct. And within a year, I think a bunch of scientists came from Europe and North America and collected a lot of seeds and seedlings and saplings and other samples, a lot of S's, seedlings, saplings, samples, and brought them back to the West. And we've been growing dawn redwood for about 80 years in the West. And in the mountains in China, we know what to expect because they've examined them and they know what they look like. But on the coast, we have no idea how tall they can get. We've had them growing for 80 years and they have not stopped growing even a bit. So they these ones have only been in the ground for 25 years and they're already like 60 or 65 feet tall. So imagine what one looks like if it was planted before 1950. And by the way, if you want to see some of the original ones, they actually have a few of them at the Morris Arboretum. They're elsewhere around the world as well. But I mean, hey, the Morris Arboretum is a hop, skip, and a jump away. You can see some of the first Metasequoia in the West right in our backyard. We've got a lot of weeping evergreens along here. 100 years ago and earlier, it was actually really common to have in the sort of Victorian garden landscape, you had a lot of oddities. So you have a lot of these weird, grotesque, weeping or tortured forms. Over there, we've got a couple of weeping spruce. This is called a weeping blue Atlas cedar. And this is a weeping cultivar of our native eastern hemlock, Tsuga canadensis. And by the way, in case you're wondering about the blue Atlas cedar here, the weeping blue Atlas cedar, the wild type Atlas cedar is a vertical growing conifer with dark green needles, and it's from North Africa, the Atlas Mountains, in fact. That's why it's called an Atlas cedar. And so this is what I would consider like a double mutant, because not only does it weep, but it's got bluish needles. So if you took a seed from one of the cones and planted it, you would get a wild type Atlas cedar. You would not get a weeping blue Atlas cedar. The only way to get a cultivar is to make a cutting of that. That's how it works. Cultivar means horticulturally cultivated variety. And it's, you know, apples are a great example of cultivar. The Granny Smith, the Fuji, the Honeycrisp, seeds from those will all make a wild type. They call them spitters because you eat the apple and you go, because it's hard and small and bitter. The only way to get more Honeycrisp is to get a cutting of a Honeycrisp and graft it and grow it into a tree. In case you were wondering, that's probably only 50 or 60 years old. Weeping trees tend to grow more slowly. It's interesting. I don't know what that is, but it's probably there's a metabolic issue. Anyhow, we've got one more before we go through the. Wait, don't tell me it's the.
Come on, Bryce, you can do it. You can do it. I know you
Puerto
can.
Olay.
Hardly. Port Cochere.
Port Cochere. Yeah.
Port Cochere.
Before we go through the Port Cochere, we've got
Actually, it's Port Cochere.
Port Cochere.
Yes.
Okay, like Sonny and Cher.
Like Sonny and Cher.
All right. We've got a tree species here that's originally from Persia, which is Iran. It's called a Persian ironwood. The horticultural Latin is Parotia persica. And this is actually a pretty large specimen for this species. It doesn't generally get this large. So this is, it's not the largest. The record holder is actually at the Morris Arboretum for Pennsylvania, at least the record. But this is nothing to scoff at. It's not one of the original plantings from the 1920 design from the Olmsted brothers. This was probably put in 70 or 80 years ago. And by the way, if you notice the bark is popping off in little chunks, that's called exfoliating bark, and that's a common thing for certain trees. Sycamore and London plane do it. Japanese Zelkova does it. A lot of the Stewardias do it, and there's actually Kusa dogwood right there that also has that exfoliating dappled bark. And anybody here familiar with witch hazel? Hamamelis? Well, you might recognize the leaves and the seed structures because they're almost identical to witch hazel, and this is actually in that family, which is Hamamelidaceae, which is also really fun to say. If I go to a party, I'll try and break that one out.
please.
So yeah, this is Persian ironwood, kind of a nifty tree, and I think the original plan has home plate around here. So this tree would be a goner.